All right, we have Dave Swanson with us. He is an attorney at Dorsey Whitney, and he has over 40 years of co-op experience, and he's going to share some information today. Dave, could you talk a little bit about the different types of co-ops that are out there?
Sure. There's actually a lot more types of co-ops than people imagine. But let me start with this. The first kind of big wave of co-ops in the United States were aimed at rural territories. And both of them were spearheaded by government programs.
Hmm.
They're agriculture co-ops, which are, very rich and thriving today, and rural electric co-ops. And the rural electric co-ops actually cover about 80% of the US landmass, but it's something like only 15% of the total customers. So when electricity was getting started in the US, the for-profit companies would only string lines in urban areas, because in the rural areas you'd have, instead of maybe 50 people on a mile of line or 100, you'd have 4 or 5. So it was a program to get electricity to dairy farms, is really what it boiled down to. And all those co-ops are, for the most part, still in existence. That was a program that went from the 30s to the maybe mid 40s. In the agriculture program, that was more, there was 2 things that the federal government did. One was passed legislation that allowed farmers to, I would say, collude with each other to set prices. It was an antitrust, an exemption for dairy farmers and grain farmers and cattle farmers to band together to set prices with whoever was going to buy things from them, as long as they use the co-op model. And the other thing was, the federal government started, this was somewhere in the same era, late teens, early 20s, a national agricultural lending system. And there's probably 60 or 70 entities that still exist in that. There's a lot of consolidation that happened. And their primary purpose is to make loans to agriculture co-ops and farmers, and for a variety of other things in rural communities. So I don't know, some of you may have heard of CoBank. It's the biggest outcome of that program. So that's where it really started. There's certainly a lot of other areas where co-ops thrive. And one of them is for purchasing groups for independent retailers or independent distributors. Because, and I'll just give you one example of that. There's a co-op of veterinarians nationwide, and they're all very small, very local. And they have a very difficult time buying the supplies they need to do their veterinarian services for dogs and cats and cows. And so they've formed a purchasing group in the co-op business model, and they get much better pricing, negotiating pricing, and taking care of some of the administration collectively, rather than doing it individually on their own, every 1 or 2 person veterinary shop. And there's many examples of that. And they've been around for, I'd say it was maybe in the 40s and 50s when independent businesses started forming these purchasing groups. And then there's more modernly, and this really was consumer co-ops, which really started in the 60s, I'd say. And it started in urban areas, and it was, one way of looking at it is, it was hippies who couldn't get the food they wanted. So they started their own little purchasing groups, and that has spawned hundreds. I think there must be 500 natural foods co-ops, community-owned groceries in the country, and there's at least 25 or 30 that I'm aware of that are in some age or stage of trying to start up right now. And then even more recently than that, worker ownership has become a big popular push for the cooperative business model. And you see there those in lots of different forms. An awful lot of them are companies that decide they want to, and an owner decides, rather than retiring, I'm going to turn this over to my employees who've worked here all these years. And so they will set up a system to finance and have the employees own through a co-op a small business, usually a small business. And then there's a lot of startups too. You also see now what I would call multi-member class co-ops or hybrid co-ops. Some people use the term, and that's co-ops that combine two of those things, especially that you see that a lot, especially with community-owned stores like the natural foods co-ops, where it's owned not just by the consumers, but also partly by the employees. And one thing about those community-owned grocery co-ops, they tend to want to have, if you look at the wages that are paid to the people who work in the natural foods co-ops across the country, it's a couple of dollars an hour at least higher than what people get in the big national grocery chains.
So I'm glad you brought up the multi-stakeholder or a hybrid cooperative, because that's what Tiny Diner is likely to become.
Yes. Yeah.
Because of to combine the community and the workers to have ownership. So can you talk a little bit about that, about restaurant cooperatives and how the options that are available in terms of forming a cooperative, because we're early in the process?
Yep, of course. In fact, there's a number of models of this around the country. I'd say to a large extent it's fairly recent, but not just the last few years. There's been a movement to have worker and consumer-owned co-ops for at least 15 or 20 years, if not more, in the US. And that works out just fine. I'm going to bring up the topic of subchapter T, which is a tax exemption that co-ops enjoy. And like you've all heard the term C Corp, that's subchapter C of the tax code. Subchapter T is in the tax code, and it applies to entities that operate on a cooperative basis. And operating on a cooperative basis basically means if you have a profit, it gets allocated to your users in one way or another, and it's not paid out or distributed based on how much investment people made. So it's a patron ownership, and it uses the word patron in subchapter T. And if you do that, and for an example, like let's just take a natural food store that has employees who are members and consumers who are members. If you allocate the year-end profit to those employees and consumers, and you have to do it within 8 months after the end of the fiscal year, and pay at least 20% out in cash. The balance can be equity in the co-op. People use different terms for it: patronage equity, capital credits, a lot of different terms, but it's basically an ownership stake in your name as a member. Then you don't have to pay income tax at the co-op level. And so that saves a fairly big expense. And it used to be really high, then it went way down. Now it looks like it's going to go up again, corporate income tax. So it can be kind of a significant economic tool to be in a co-op model. Well, in a co-op model, you can have multiple classes of members, and there are many co-ops that have many classes of members. But it really doesn't work to have both the buyer and seller of a product or a service be members in a co-op. But it does work to have buyers, like the members of a natural foods co-op, consumers, and employees of the co-op. And that you still can be operating on a cooperative basis, even though you take the total profit and divide it between those two classes or categories of members. So one thing that I would say is there's a lot of co-ops that have done this, restaurants, variety of different things, some in the natural foods industry. And the experience I've had is, there's sort of a, what would you say, a tendency to invite conflict if you have the people who go into a store and buy products getting part of the profits and having part of the governance, and the people who work in the store having part of the profits and part of the governance, because the more you pay your laborers, the less the consumers' profits would be. So I think it's a model that works. It's a good idea to establish, what percentage goes to employees and what percentage goes to consumers in the bylaws, and have it be fixed, and say that you can't change that unless both groups agree that it's going to be changed. And that just kind of takes the conflict off the table, or at least it makes it less likely to be a big, internal issue.
So that's great. Can you talk a little bit about Minnesota Statute 308A and B?
I sure will. So 308A is, and I suppose you could say I have a bias here because I'm in Minnesota, but it's one of the better co-op. 308A, that's the traditional old co-op model or statute in Minnesota. One of the better ones that I've seen in the country. It gives a lot of flexibility to establish your rules when you form a co-op, how the governance happens, how the profits are distributed. A lot of the statutes are much more strict in what your flexibility is. But the one thing it does not allow, it does not allow for any equity participation by anyone other than a member who buys goods in the store or works for the store or whatever the patronage arrangement is. So 308B came along, this is, I'd say 20 some years ago. And the idea was to allow a co-op to have both, participating members, patron members, who earn their profit by use, or earn their, share of the profit by use, and to have peer investors who just own a share of stock and get a percentage of the profits or the growth in value as a result of pure investment. And that was really where it came from. And then it kind of caught fire, and it was done. The Uniform Law Commission adopted a statute that was somewhat similar to 308B. But at the end of the day, other than that, there is not a lot of difference between 308A and 308B. In fact, if you read them, they're strikingly similar, and their outlines look very similar. And so for most co-ops are not going to have outside investment. In fact, I know of only very few that have done that. It destroys that subchapter T, tax exemption. So it has not been utilized for that a lot, but either one of them works. The other thing about those two is 308B speaks in terms of membership interests, but not stock. And 308A it just lays out the choice to either call your membership interests shares of stock or just membership. But those are the two primary differences between those two statutes.
And I know that there's some controversy there because letting someone get equity in the cooperative, it sort of is antithetical to the premise of a cooperative.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole idea came about not recognizing that that's the case very much, but also recognizing that if the only place that you can get startup capital from is members, sometimes that makes it really hard to raise the money you need. But there certainly tools for that, even with a pure, worker owned or consumer owned co-op.
Well, and I would imagine that if you are starting a cooperative and want to do that equity piece, that you could still have the rules, your bylaws state that everybody gets sort of one vote, as well as limiting looking for patient capital, so
That's
that
right.
you're not you're not getting someone who wants to invest a lot and then make a lot of money off of it.
And have a lot of control. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right. In fact, I don't know, the 308B actually allows you to have up to 80% ownership and voting control, up to 80% ownership of a co-op, and up to 50% voting control with the investor only member. But I think there's frankly been very few that have utilized that at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
For exactly the reason you're talking about. Internal governance is one of the key features of a co-op business model.
And so can you talk a little bit about the history of co-ops in Minnesota? Because I know that and I'm talking about the consumer co-ops, grocery stores specifically.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, actually, Minnesota is really amazing. And the Twin Cities is really amazing in this consumer co-op sector. There was a big groundswell of interest in starting what I would say is not natural and not highly processed food products available in urban areas. And it was not easy to get things in an urban area. The grocery store system just didn't offer it. And so most of the co-ops, I think at one time there were 15 or 20 co-ops in the Twin Cities area. If you look at a map of the community-owned grocery store co-ops in the US, it's like there's dots all over in a big blob in Minneapolis, because there's so many of them here. It's really amazing. It's certainly not the only place where they have them, but it was very much a groundswell of it, very much where a lot of this natural food co-op, community-owned grocery co-op businesses started. So there's many of them. Some of them have consolidated, not a huge amount, but a little bit at the beginning stages. And I would say somewhere between the early 60s and 70s, they were very community owned and very community run, and many of them had volunteer labor. So if you remember, you not only went in and bought things in the store and participated in governance, you also worked there, spent time stocking the shelves. Most of them have outgrown that. Part of the reason for that is if you have a person, there's an issue about whether a member who volunteers labor is really an employee and entitled to all the benefits of being an employee, like having to have insurance, having to have time off, having to get or participate in a pension fund or workers' compensation program and that sort of thing. So most of those grassroots co-ops have moved away from volunteer labor. There's still a few that have left of those around the country, but not very many. I know there's one in Brooklyn, New York, where I think it's all volunteer labor.
Wow. Well, Dave, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise about co-ops. Before we sign off, is there anything else you want to add about co-ops that we haven't talked about?
Well, I'd just say I like the culture of co-ops. And I work with some very big ones and some very small ones. They're all over the map in age and size. But when I was a younger lawyer, I worked with a couple of companies that were listed on the stock exchange, pure investment, and let's, buy shares and make money kind of a concept. And I worked with co-ops, and I found that the culture of people that were comfortable and attracted to the co-ops was just much more comfortable to me, because people tended to be focused not on how can I climb a ladder and how can I win this job, but how can we make things happen collectively for the good of everyone. And that's why I work with co-ops.
Well, again, thanks for joining us as part of our info session and workshop on turning Tiny Diner into a cooperative. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks again.
Well, you too. Thank you very much.